We are getting ready to start this. Why does it never advance unless I go over and click on it? Get the focus back. All right. So companies love analytics. They love to track impressions on landing pages and leads and conversions. Let's say you have a client that works with a third-party data partner. We'll call them TPDP Incorporated. When you have a third-party data partner that wants to inject tracking codes, they inevitably say stuff like, the collect code should be placed just before the closing head tag, or the page view code should be placed directly below the head tag following the above tag. But managing JavaScript assets with snippets like this is such a 1996 style approach. You know, we all remember those bad old days when everybody was just coding spaghetti code and everything was done directly in the HTML templates and stuff. And if you're a Drupal themer, you're probably already aware that you can include these snippets directly in a twig template. And sometimes that's the simplest thing to do. You can open up, you know, page.html.twig and put the JavaScript right in it. But really, that's not the best way to manage JavaScript in Drupal. There is a Drupal JavaScript API. And in this presentation, I'll show you a few different ways of including JavaScript in Drupal projects following the API, and introduce you to the concepts of libraries and behaviors, which is very central to the whole concept. But first, let's talk about...
Mr. Obert, let me interrupt and say, but first, be pre-first. Can anyone that is not speaking mute? And Mr. Obert, if you have forgotten to disable your Slack notifications, I would suggest that you do that.
Oh, Slack notifications.
Because man, I tell you, if I hear any more knocking in my head, you know, we're going to have to engage the company therapist.
Yes, when the lunch and learns a rockin', don't come a knockin', I believe.
That's right. I like it.
No, that's
true. Anyway, welcome everybody. Thanks for showing, and good to see you all on Friday.
Pause notifications for how about 2 hours? That ought to do it. All right, no more knocking from me. Everybody else is muted. And now let's talk about data protection. There it is. That is a photograph that hopefully you guys haven't seen this meme in the wild, because I took the photo and I actually ordered those fortune cookies when the GDPR came online. I was working at an agency, and a friend of mine was going to do a similar kind of it was less technical, but he was just going to talk about the legal implications, more from like a project manager and site builder kind of perspective. And as a surprise, I ordered these cookies that say, we have updated our privacy policy. By accepting cookies, you agree to be tracked. And then it says, learn HTTP 200 OK, because they always say learn Chinese and then go to vocabulary word at the bottom. So hopefully you've never seen that before, unless you've seen my presentation or my slides somewhere. But I ordered a whole box of these, and the guy forgot to take them to the Drupal design conference, and they were just sitting in the office, and we ate them, and that's the end of that story. But I did manage to get one good picture, which comes in handy later. So anyway, remember, I'm not a lawyer. This is not legal advice, but the GDPR came out a few years ago. That's the General Data Protection Regulation. It's a legal framework that sets guidelines for the collection and processing of personal information of individuals within the European Union. So personal identifiable information, PII, you know, or if you're dealing with like HIPAA, there's like PHI, your personal health information, any kind of like personal information that allows people to know who's browsing the website. And that includes even just their IP address, which is part of tracking. There's a lot of things that could be considered, you know, that you can do now to sort of fingerprint people's browser so that you know who it is when they're coming to your website. And essentially, you know, this gives companies really good information that they can use to make decisions about who are their customers and who are their leads and their conversions and things like this. But it also is kind of rightly considered a little shady, and a little bit, sometimes people are a little paranoid about it. And because of that, governments, starting really with the data protection laws in Europe, really were the warning shot for that, to safeguard people's rights to not be tracked online if they didn't want to be tracked online. So the GDPR was activated across the European Union on May 25th, 2018. Then we have a new one, the CCPA, which is the California Consumer Privacy Act. And that's a state statute intended to enhance privacy rights and consumer protection for residents of California in the United States. The CCPA was activated in California on January 1st of last year. So it's been around for just a little bit longer than a year. First, we're going to talk about the GDPR. So what's data privacy? Your IP address is just one of many things that are considered personal data. It could be your name. It could be your address. There are a lot of things that, and I could call up I didn't really put all that detail on the slide, but it's pretty easy to Google if you want to figure out what type of data is covered by it. But it's pretty common sense. It's like anything that you can use to identify somebody who's otherwise like an anonymous visitor just visiting your site. They're not even necessarily logging in, they're just visiting the site. And users can withdraw consent and reserve the right to object to processing. Consent, in fact, in the GDPR is always required with few exceptions. So really it's an opt-in to tracking, not an opt-out. So you're not tracking by default with the GDPR. You're not tracking by default. You're gonna require someone's explicit permission. And they have security restrictions. Security should be up to the highest available standards. Security and compliance methods are outlined in detail across 99 articles of this regulation, and it's enforced by national data protection authorities. This is always funny to me because it says such as the ICO in the UK, and I copied that from something that was before Brexit. So the UK isn't in the European Union anymore, but all of the countries have their own little data protection authorities. All the EU countries have their own, and that's how it's enforced. Penalties can be quite severe for the GDPR violations. Fines of up to 20 million euros or 4% of your company's annual revenue, which depending on your annual revenue could be a big, big number. Also, there could be potential audits and sanctions. And consumers have the right to sue. So if you're like, you feel like you've been tracked or that a website that you visited has been in violation, like you can individually bring a lawsuit on behalf of a GDPR violation or collectively. So the resources that you see down at the bottom are linked presentations from DrupalCon in Nashville and Design for Drupal in Boston in 2018. And they go into a lot more detail and a lot more depth than I will here. The second one at designfordrupal.org is the one that I made the fortune cookies for. So that's my friend DJ from Oomph. And then there's the CCPA, which it's a similar statute. The data privacy component is, again, everybody's got an IP address when they visit your site, and that's something that's going to be in your referrer logs. So like right away, if you're connecting that with anything, that's going to be tracking. So people, basically your website, if it's going to be California compliant, you need to provide an opt-out link. And this weird acronym DNSMPI means do not sell my personal information. So you can be tracking it to some extent as long as you're not profiting off it, as long as you're not reselling it to somebody who's using it for advertising or some other purposes or marketing in some other way. And consent is only required for minors and for people who have previously opted out. So the CCPA, unlike the GDPR, is by default an opt-in to tracking, and you just need to provide that side door for people who want to exit the tracking. You need to have that built into your site. Security components are also a little more lax with the California regulation. There are no explicit security requirements outlined in the actual statute beyond reasonable security. But it leans on something called Cis Controls, which is the Center for Internet Security. And you can see the links at the bottom there. There's a, well, I'm supposed to say that right after I get through the third column, but essentially the Center for Internet Security has its own website, and the CIS controls are listed in detail there. And consumers can seek damages for subpar security practices if they're discovered. The penalties are a little bit less than the GDPR as well, but they can add up. They're up to $7,500 for each violation, up to $750 per affected user. So if you're doing business in California and you have a lot of customers, that can add up pretty quickly. And also consumers have the right to sue. But this applies only to for-profit businesses that are doing business in the state of California. So if your website is for a nonprofit, you don't need to worry at all about CCPA compliance. And if your website is a for-profit, but it's your friendly neighborhood like taco truck in New York City that never is going to have any customers in California, then you also don't need to worry about the CCPA compliance. So those two links at the bottom. The first one is for Bay Area Drupal Camp session in 2019. And that goes into more detail about this law than I will. And the other link goes to the CIS Controls at Center for Internet Security, as I've already mentioned. So let's take a look at some contributed Drupal modules that can help you with your compliance. I think the colors are a little funky here. I'm not sure when that happened. I should have gone through all the slides, but I think that this one looks a little grayed out compared to how it used to. Yeah, that's just, anyway. So all of these things, this is a partial list. I've omitted any modules that don't have a stable release candidate because those aren't covered by the Drupal security policy. And also, you know, there's not all of these are applicable to everything that you're going to want to do. You'll notice that the one at the top, though, is just far and away the winner by orders of magnitude. EU cookie compliance supports Drupal 7, 8, and 9. And the last time I checked, I haven't updated this number since I ran the same session at the Drupal camp in New York City. But no, it was the Bay Area Drupal. Which one was it? I don't know. Anyway, I do so many Drupal camps. But so there's almost 100,000 sites using this. And if you look at the other ones, the GDPR compliance module only supports Drupal 8. So if you're going to want to upgrade to Drupal 9, that's not there yet. As last I checked, it may be now. Then there's Cookie Pro and Cookie Pro CCPA. Those also only support 7 and 8. And look at how many sites. Last time I checked, there were less than 500 sites using both of those. There was another one here, Cookies, with a lowercase I and everything else all capital. And it actually looks kind of cool. It does support Drupal 8 and 9. Not a lot of people using it. It's not that popular. So feel free to experiment with it. I have extensively used the EU cookie compliance module. So that is what the rest of this presentation is gonna lean on for reference. So out of the box, if you go to Drupal.org project EU_cookie_compliance, you can install this module. This is what it looks like out of the box. It puts that little purple bar across the bottom that says, we use cookies. Do you want the cookies? And you either say, yes, I want the cookies, or you say, no, I don't want the cookies. You can change the color of it. You can change the CSS. It's all like, it's very friendly, user-friendly in terms of once it's installed, it has an admin menu that you can go and change all sorts of things about it. It will automatically link to a privacy policy if you have one. You just check a box to say, yeah, link to my privacy policy, and it will actually scan your site for a likely page that matches different URL slugs where you'd expect to find a privacy policy. It makes it really, really super, super easy to set it up. And by default, you know, this is what it looks like. This is what it does. All compliance implementations will offer something similar since the law requires an explicit action to opt into tracking. This is the basic configuration, and you might not be able to read all the small print in this on your Zoom window, but essentially the small print says, when using the opt-in or opt-out consent options, you can block certain JavaScript files from being loaded when consent isn't given. This is a simple configuration, which may be sufficient for compliance without any custom code. The linked issue queue at the bottom, Drupal.org project Google tag issues 2973865. Basically, that's for Google Tag Manager. And if you manage tracking with Google Tag Manager, this shows how you can disable GTM. And then you can manage all your other scripts with GTM, right? You can have Google Tag Manager loading all the tags that provide all your other scripts for all your tracking and marketing automation stuff. And then you centralize it there. And this is the way that you can just turn on Google Tag Manager or turn it off in one place. But there's another thing that the module actually exposes, which is this has agreed behavior. And I haven't defined behaviors yet, but essentially it's JavaScript. That's a way that the Drupal API asks you to package up your JavaScript. I'm about to teach you all about it, but just so you know, at this point, all you need to know about it is that the developers of the EU cookie compliance module have already done so, and they've already provided this Drupal behavior, which is going to give you this has agreed method that you can call. And it returns true if somebody has clicked, yes, I agree to, be tracked or whatever, with your little banner. You can put the banner at the top, the bottom, or whatever, like there's a lot of things you can configure about it. But the essential thing is when somebody consents to be tracked, it's going to set this to true. Otherwise it's false. And you can wrap stuff in that, as you see here. If not EU, Drupal EU cookie compliance has agreed. So essentially, that's going to negate the whatever the value is of that. And so if the person hasn't agreed and the value is false, then it's going to return true in this conditional, and it's going to run this little snippet of code that just says window GA disable UA, and the X's have to be replaced by your actual ID number, and then set that to true. And that will basically disable Google Analytics without a custom module. But wait, what's a behavior? Well, we'll get a little bit deeper into that right here. What's a behavior and how can a module provide one? People are in of document ready, which essentially is like, oh, the page has loaded and now I'm going to run something. And they've been around since Drupal 6. The official documentation is here at the link. If you get the slides, you can just copy the links off of the slides, so you don't have to take detailed notes right now. But the official documentation is at this Drupal.org node 304.258. And as you can see for D6, it was a little bit different. Hopefully you guys aren't still using Drupal 6, but it is a consistent syntax for Drupal 7, 8, and 9. And I've also included a couple more additional resources at the bottom, a couple of longer articles. The Lillibot article in particular, I must have read that a dozen times when I was trying to figure out what the heck is up with these Drupal behaviors. It explains it really, really well. Lillibot is a great agency and they do a lot of great stuff, and they have really good blogs. And this is one that I've definitely leaned on really heavily when I was a Drupal behaviors newbie. So I highly recommend reading that. And the other one from Ben Marshall goes a little bit more deeply into the history of the behaviors, how they evolved over time, and all the different implementations of the Drupal JavaScript API. So note that the examples show the behavior name object added as a property of the Drupal.behaviors object. But the has agreed behavior was namespace to the EU cookie compliance module. I highly recommend using the pattern shown here on this slide to create your own behaviors. If you need to attach multiple behaviors, I recommend using Drupal.behaviors.my_custom_module_behavior. And then you can do Drupal behaviors, my custom module, another behavior, etc. It's just easier to take advantage of Drupal's built-in Drupal attached behaviors by registering your custom behaviors this way, because what it's going to do is when it loads the thing here, characteristics of a behavior, I'll give you a little bit more of the background, is like they provide an easy way to initialize JavaScript on page loads and to reinitialize on AJAX calls. So that's a little bit different from just putting some JavaScript in there that's just going to fire once when you load your page. Behaviors can also fire off again when certain sections of your page reload with like an AJAX call. The Drupal .behaviors object is a property of the Drupal object, and we extend this object to add new behaviors to our module. Now, your new object needs to have at least an attach method. And when Drupal attach behaviors is called, it will iterate through all the behavior objects and call their respective attach methods. So that's, in a nutshell, that's what happens when the page loads and you've attached a behavior or whatever. That's how you know your code is going to fire. And behaviors also accept context and settings as arguments. I'll go a little bit more in depth about that, but that is actually where Drupal behaviors get really cool, because the context contains DOM elements that you can act on. And by default, it's the entire DOM the first time. But you could pass it a different context if it's going to be firing on like an AJAX call that only affects part of your page, then it's going to have a smaller context. And it's really cool what you can do with that. And then settings can pass values from your custom Drupal PHP code, which is what I love about Drupal behaviors. And you can do some really cool stuff with custom modules. And that's exactly what we're going to learn about next. So here's the attach. Can you guys read the small print here of the code sample? It says Drupal.behaviors, my custom module body attach. And then it's going to say attach : function, context settings. You'll note that the syntax highlighting here from PHP Storm, context is lit up because I'm actually using it. Settings is grayed out because I'm not using it here. And then essentially, the first time Drupal attach behaviors is called, as I may have already mentioned, context will contain the entire document object model. But then on subsequent calls, as when new DOM elements are inserted into the document via AJAX-driven content, it may only contain a smaller subset of the affected HTML. And if you're not using AJAX, you may only want to attach your behavior once for each DOM element that matches your selector. So that's what this .once is doing, and .once, .each, and I'll go a little bit more into detail about that. So remember your third-party data partner. They said, oh, the collect code should be placed just before the closing head tag, and the page view code should be placed directly below the head tag following the above tag. But you don't need to do it the 1996 way. You can use, here's one way to do it with hook page attachments, where you can actually, if you're familiar with coding a custom Drupal module, and then you've got your like my module folder, and inside there you've got my module.module, right? That's your, all your hooks go in there. It's not where you're putting all of the cool object-oriented Symfony, HTTP kernel, service classes and things that are going to be, dependency injection and stuff like that. This is for your old school Drupal hooks, the same as they used to be in Drupal 7, Drupal 6, and even further back. The hook system, which is how you sort of override a certain part of Drupal's essential functionality. And you can use this hook page attachments to attach just a script type text JavaScript element. And this is only appropriate for very short JavaScript snippets like you see on the page here. It says function, my custom module page attachments, and then you pass it array attachments, and it says attachments attached HTML head, the data, and it's going to be, that's a renderable array. If you're familiar with this in Drupal, it's like all of these things. It's like type, HTML tag, tag script, value, and I put just a one-liner in there. Console log attaching inline JS via hook page attachments. So when this gets attached to the page, it's actually going to just log that one line to the console. It's going to say, oh, I attached a little inline JavaScript. Not super useful. That's the simplest way of doing it, but not the best way. There's a better way. Let's say that your client is saying, oh, the collect code should be placed just before the closing head tag. Page view code should be placed directly below the head tag following the above tag. Then you can attach the libraries. Essentially, libraries are, you've got a libraries.yaml. It's like, just like what we were talking about, there's a folder, my module, and then inside there you're putting my module.module. That's where you put your hooks. If you put my module.libraries.yml, that's your libraries.yaml file. And you're going to define in there, this is very small print, guys, and I'm sorry about that. I might want to revise this slide and make the screenshot a little bit bigger. I feel like it used to be like 50-50. But where what it actually says in it is collect code. Yeah, it's cropped funny too. I should have edited every single slide before this. But yeah, this is essentially.
They put a link in chat.
Yeah, it's not going to be super easy to read on the screen, but like definitely the libraries documentation is on Drupal.org, so it'll show you how to set it up. And essentially what you're going to do is you're going to define a library in the YAML, and you're going to give a path to where it is, and then you can tell Drupal how to attach it. And if you attach it in more than one place, Drupal doesn't care. It's only going to load it that first time. It's not going to waste cycles. It keeps track of it in a really smart way. So libraries can be used to attach JavaScript and CSS and things like that to your Drupal stuff while you're building your pages and you're building your templates. But essentially libraries, it's just a way of keeping everything tidy. Essentially I'm just finding in my notes on number 16 already, right? So the externally hosted collect code is defined instead as an externally hosted and minified library. Data partner said they wanted the collect code in the header, so we put header true in the YAML. The page view code will be defined as a behavior in the tpdp.js file, which may contain as many libraries as we need. Note that our behaviors will depend on core Drupal and core jQuery, and I put that in there. You can barely see it as dependencies. So there's one of the YAML stanzas is going to say dependencies : and underneath that I put core/jQuery, core/Drupal, and I put core/js-cookie, which is the newer way of managing cookies. All of this stuff is kind of in flux right now because jQuery is kind of being deprecated. It's getting out of style because it's so old, and there's drawbacks to using jQuery, but it's still very popular because it's really easy to use. I'm a little sad that the slide got a little malformed there, but essentially those additional resources down at the bottom definitely show you, just in the Drupal.org docs, if you're creating a custom module or you're creating a custom theme, it shows you how to add style sheets, CSS and JavaScript, JS to a Drupal module or to a Drupal theme. And that's the real place to go to get more in-depth knowledge about it, since unfortunately you can't really read that slide. This one is much easier to read. This one says that add Drupal behaviors to your library with this one weird trick. So if that's not clickbaity enough for you, you're never gonna hear about it, but click on it. Here we go. Hook page attachments. This one's really, really simple. Implement hook page attachments, my custom module page attachments. And then you say attachments attached library equals my custom module /tpdp. It's referring to the library that we just defined in libraries.yaml. So this example shows you, once you've defined it in libraries.yaml, you can attach it to your page. And essentially, this is the preferred method of managing JavaScript assets in Drupal. It makes it really simple, it makes it really clean, and it's easy to keep track of. And as I said before, Drupal knows whether it's already been loaded somewhere else. It's not going to load the same library twice. So all these things are great, and it's the Drupal way. Here is my custom module JS, tpdp.js. This is where you keep the guts of your library. And this is how you define a behavior in a text file in your custom module library. And all JavaScript behaviors must be declared inside of a closure. This is for like variable scope. I mean, basically, you wrap the entire file in the closure. The behaviors are declared as objects, and they must have an attach method, as I mentioned before. And then the next line selects a DOM element within the context. which your behavior will attach to. So let's take a closer look at this. There's a Stack Exchange answer down there at the bottom, which is if you go to that DrupalStackExchange.com, that URL there, it's my answer. Feel free to up it and give me some karma. But essentially, if all that's not my answer. This is the other one's going to be my answer. Sorry, guys. Now I'm just losing my thread. But if all developers properly use the API, you would likely not have to use .once parentheses. However, you cannot count on developers using the API correctly, so once insulates you against that. Is this the right? I'm reading 19. This is like attach function. This is selector context. Yes, here we go. Selector context. So where it says once base code each function, right? It should say body context. There it is at the beginning. Sorry, guys. Attach function context settings, body context. Can you read that? Hopefully you can. That's what gets attached once to the body. But if you substitute the word div for body, if you use a div selector instead of the body, it won't just run once on the page. It'll run once for each div that it finds in the DOM. I feel a little better about this. I'm getting my thread back. So as soon as I saw the Stack Exchange thing, I got really excited and I wanted to send you guys to my other Stack Exchange answer. That's coming up real soon. So anyway, selector can be any selector used to identify any DOM element, a class, an ID, an element, a pseudo element, etc. And this, when you go once each like this attaches your behavior once to each element that matches the selector. But this is another cool trick you can do to prevent your behavior from executing more than once. If type of context location is not equal to undefined, then do your stuff. This will only fire once on document load. And I've seen this, I saw this in a module somewhere and I just copied it and I've used it, since then when it's appropriate. But it's just another cool trick you can do to make sure that if you just want something to run once every time you load a page. Now here is the settings. When we attach our libraries, we can also pass values to Drupal settings, but we're not using that here yet. Notice the line under the console log statement where we pair a value with the set org ID key and push it to our data partner. What if the data partner wants us to use a sandbox API in a non-production environment? How can we set this value dynamically? This is where Drupal behaviors really soar. So what you're seeing here is this is just a fixed value. It's saying TPDP push set org ID 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 0. And that is always going to push the same number, right? But I'm going to show you in a minute how to come back and dynamically set that. So remember hook page attachments? This example now up on the screen shows Acquia Cloud environment variables that it uses the environment variables to determine whether to use sandbox or production org ID values. So if you notice here, it says, tell JavaScript to use production API in the production environment. It says if is set $_env AH production. This is PHP asking for an environment variable in an Acquia Cloud environment. And if it returns true, first of all, if that value is set, and then if you check the value and it returns true, then it's going to use the production API in the production environment. Otherwise, it's going to use the sandbox API in all other environments. So this is in hook page attachments when you go to attach it, and it's going to pass that value attachments, attached, Drupal settings. Then you can namespace it out from there a little bit. You don't have to do this, but I highly recommend you put my custom module, whatever your module name is, as your next sort of namespace. And you'll notice here I even put a little additional namespace for TPDP in case there's different APIs that my module is interacting with. I'm going to keep them all clean from each other here in the Drupal settings. And then the value finally is org ID. So I'll be able to take this and pass it to Drupal settings. And then on the other end in my Drupal behavior, I'll be able to catch it. Here it is, has agreed. We're going to check for consent before we attach the collect code using the has agreed behavior from the EU cookie compliance module. So first I check if not EU cookie compliance, which it's not installed, right? Or not EU cookie compliance has agreed, then I just bail out. I just return because I'm assuming the cookie consent is not given. All this other JavaScript I'm not going to use. Else, console log base collect code attached to HTML body. And then I'm going to push set org ID, but instead of just only having one value that I could say in my JavaScript, I'm going to use, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, whatever that was. Now I'm going to be able to get a different value conditionally, depending on what my PHP code said back in the module file where I was attaching this with hook page attachments. And it's passing it to settings, my custom module, .tpdp.org ID. And I can get that value here in my JavaScript, which I set back in my PHP. So this allows you to do, this is just like a very simple example of the kind of tricks you can do with this. But it's allowing us to push the dynamically assigned value of the setting to our third-party data partner using this JavaScript API. And it's something that you wouldn't easily be able to do in a snippet. But wasn't all this about cookies? So cookie handling, you check for consent first, same way as in the last slide. It's going to say attach function context settings, and then it says if not EU cookie compliance or not EU cookie compliance has agreed, then bail out. We're not going to do any of this tracking stuff because they haven't given consent. But let's say the consent is given, else, right? Then it says if cookies.get TPDB consent time is not equal to undefined, then let consent time equal new date and cookies.set TPDB consent time, and it shows consent time to ISO string. Essentially, you're setting a new timestamp, you're setting it to an ISO string, and you're setting an expiry on it. This is standard cookie stuff. What we're using here with the capital C cookies, it's just a newer way of handling cookies in Drupal. Instead of using jQuery for it, this is like a newer way. And I'm gonna find the jQuery cookie implementation is deprecated in favor of core/JS cookie, which is in Drupal core. So this is the new way to do it. If you're familiar with jQuery cookie, you can still use jQuery to set your cookies. And a lot of people are still using jQuery in Drupal, but essentially it's being gradually deprecated. It's being gradually sort of moved to the side. Really? So I highly recommend learning the new way of doing it. Now, you can legally set the cookie because you know that consent has been granted. What really happens though when we add this snippet I talked about before to advanced settings, custom JS in Google Analytics? Drupal actually loads this JavaScript from Google Analytics and executes it. If consent is not granted, we tell Google not to show our client the analytics. But is this really compliant? I'm not so sure. Google still gets some data and the client still sees tracking code downloaded and executed. More info, I believe this is probably the one where I wrote my answer that I'm looking for the updates. I don't know why I said that before. As soon as I saw Stack Exchange, I wanted to ask for that. So if your client's a nonprofit and you don't do business in the European Union, then this approach may be sufficient. But I can show you how to achieve stricter compliance with Drupal behaviors. we can use has agreed with the Drupal behavior. This is a bit more compliant because it gets the opt-out JavaScript from Drupal rather than from Google. Essentially, it's the same sort of trick as we were doing before. We attach the function, and we're going to set the default value of has agreed to false in case EU cookie compliance module is not enabled. And then you can also set the same value as the web property used on the site. You'll notice here it says GA disable UA XXXX1. Those X's are going to be replaced with 4 numbers, or maybe even more numbers. But this is how the snippet was in the linked Drupal issue queue from the earlier slide. So I let has agreed equal false, and then if Drupal EU cookie compliance, if that's even there to be checked, then we check has agreed equals the value of whatever the has agreed method returns from that behavior. And that will allow us to disable the Google Analytics tracking if they have not agreed. Rather than asking Google, downloading the stuff from them and then saying, oh, by the way, they don't want to be tracked, so just ignore this. This is a little bit stricter way of doing it. And if you're really paranoid, right? If you're really looking for paranoid compliance and fair use of copyrighted material as provided for in Section 107 of the US copyright law. So I'm hoping that Ozzy Osbourne doesn't sue me for using the album cover. But essentially the next step, there's a way of doing this, like making sure that your third-party forms don't even get loaded at all. You're going to put a placeholder in your markup, and then you're going to scan for that. And if the consent is granted, you're going to inject your JavaScript snippets that way. So essentially, I was doing this for Marketo forms for a client, but it would work for any similar implementation. And I took out all of the third-party data partner forms, and I replaced them with just an empty div element that had an ID, which corresponds to the unique third-party form ID for each form that I was embedding. If you're familiar with Marketo, this is what the example actually refers to, but other sort of tracking and marketing automation platforms will have very often a similar approach. And what you can do is, if there's a unique code that's associated with each of your forms that you're trying to inject, then I make that the ID of the div, and then I give it this class that I'm going to scan for, third-party form wrapper. So my custom JavaScript behavior looks for all the DOM elements that match that third-party form wrapper class. So let third-party form wrappers equal document, get elements by class name, and the class name is third-party form wrapper. That's going to return this big, it's not actually an array. I think in JavaScript, it's like an HTML collection element or something, but it's very array-like. And if the length of that is equal to 0, then return. We haven't found any third-party form wrappers on the page, and it'll bail out. But then, if it did find one, we're going to build a form elements JSON object that contains markup for each form, and we're going to use this approach to inject the form. So essentially, if has agreed down there in the middle, like 3/4 of the way down the snippet where it says markup plus equals form ID equals TPTP form underscore plus ELID, and that's your element ID, which came from the ID of the element that we're targeting. And then it continues to concatenate and close off that element, and it closes off the form element. And that's what the Marketo Munchkin script is looking for, that special form ID with that unique number in it that it's going to recognize, and it's going to say, okay, I'm injecting my Marketo form into that. So that's just a way that you can do this. The third-party data partner specific implementation details are omitted here just for clarity. But this is the overall approach. Essentially, you can just remove all the JavaScript tracking snippets from your site completely, put something else where you want to inject them, and locate all those elements, bail out if you don't find any of them. And then if consent has not been granted or the EU cookie compliance module is not installed or enabled, therefore has agreed is not even available to check, then you're gonna bail out. But if consent is granted, you use the 4-digit ID to look up the custom substitute content. Sorry, if it's not granted, my module looked up substitute placeholder content that said something like, please accept cookies to view the Yo-Yo Dine Incorporated Nomovision mailing list, subscribe, whatever the form is, you know. But if consent has been granted, then I use the same 4-digit ID to inject the JavaScript snippet for each of the third-party forms into the placeholder div, just using a combination of string manipulation and a call to the jQuery get script method. So I leave the implementation details as an exercise to the viewer, but if you have any questions, please ask. Then there's also this other thing called JavaScript type rewriting. And essentially, it's another way of, yeah, I feel like the slide doesn't have the right picture on it either. I think I left this thing alone for a few months and it changed on me a little bit, but I should have gone through this slide by slide. But anyway, this is a new technique to me, JavaScript type rewriting. Cookie Pro docs, which I was looking at for a former client, say that this is one of the most efficient methods of preventing cookies controlled by script tags being set without consent. And they also say this method requires the least amount of change to your site. Well, I haven't tested it yet, but it's basically the same idea as my div injection. You're supposed to take like a, this is just the hook page attachments again. It's the wrong screenshot, guys. I'm sorry about that. But it's what a note to end on. But anyway, the idea is that there's such a thing as JavaScript type rewriting. And essentially what you would do at JavaScript type rewriting is instead of saying that the type is script, JavaScript, whatever, you're going to just say it's text. And that stuff's going to be sitting there in your page markup. And then basically when consent is granted, you go through all of those things and rewrite the type of the tag so that it then becomes an active JavaScript. I haven't really implemented anything that way ever, but that would be the approach. So that's basically, that's the end of the thing. If we have a couple of minutes, I think 10 minutes for any questions that anybody has. And again, as it says on the screen, I'm not a lawyer. This is not legal advice. In general, the best practice is to code for the strictest interpretation of the applicable statutes. If your client is looking for a loophole, have them consult with their legal department. Don't be afraid to raise a flag if you feel that your client is exposing you to legal liability. And as Jamie Valentine said earlier, you can cover your butt by having them indemnify you. You can write up paperwork that says, I warned you that this wasn't compliant. So if you get sued, I'm off the hook. And as long as they sign that, you should be okay. Anybody got questions? We got a few minutes left for sure. I guess I went a little slow this time because I got a little disoriented in the middle because the slides changed on me. But other than that, I'd say this is the best I've done on this particular presentation. So feel free to type anything in the sidebar. I noticed somebody says that Muzzle app is a handy app, and that's Albert Volkman. We should definitely listen to that guy. And then thank you, Jeremy, for pasting the how to add style sheets to your Drupal module, Drupal documentation. Totally great. I see some thumbs up, so I'm not seeing any questions. You can type them in the chat, or at this point, you can even unmute yourself here at the end if you got something to say or something to ask. I am happy to answer any questions that you've got about either about the legal code or the PHP or JavaScript code. Mike is pointing out that it's important to note multiple US states have potential online privacy laws in process, so it's not just California. That is true. At the moment, it's Europe and California, but we may find that all 50 states are going to have a different rule about this, and some of them are already working on it. So that is just something to kind of keep your ear to the ground and see what the new developments are. But essentially, if anybody wants to not be tracked, no matter what law, what statute, or what regulation is mandating that, then you can use these sort of techniques to prevent the tracking scripts from executing until consent is given, or in the case of California, to allow the tracking to occur until someone wants to opt out of it, and then switch it off when they want to opt out, because you got to do what they want. Another thing to know about the GDPR, since nobody's really asking, is yes, everything that I talked about also has an effect on the site's privacy policy. This is something that a client that I worked with very recently I said, look, I don't think you're really in compliance, but maybe you feel that like you're not going to get sued because you're not really doing business with anybody in Europe. But the way the law is written is like if somebody whose residence is in Germany or France or whatever, and they come over to New York City and they're sitting in a hotel room in New York City or Los Angeles and they access your website, you're liable. You can't tell by their IP address whether or not they're a citizen of this country. They can still sue you, you know? So it comes down to like a calculation, essentially flagrant violators that are affecting hundreds of thousands, millions of customers, they're going to get sued for big dollars. People that just get a couple edge cases, they might not worry about it quite as much. So, you know, that's what the client that I was just talking about did, is they made that sort of, their legal team said, it doesn't really apply to us on the scale that we're going to get sued. We're going to alter our terms of service and privacy policy so that it makes it explicit that by agreeing to use the site, you understand that if you're in California, it might not, or if you're a European citizen, it might not exactly, you're going to agree to it according to our privacy policy. And that's a gray area that I don't particularly recommend. But if you've got a team of lawyers that says, we stand behind this, this language covers your butt and you're good to go, then trust your lawyers by all means. Don't just trust the lowly IT guy who came in to warn you about it. So that's pretty much where I stand with that. If there's anything else, anybody, we got a couple more minutes. Did you like it? Oh, I hear a keyboard now. Somebody unmuted themselves. Great job. Oh, thank you. Thank you. Excellent info. Awesome. That's what I like to hear. I did stay a little closer to time than the other two times. I didn't leave as much time for questions, but I really didn't get a lot of questions anyway. So I feel like I did well. All right, thank you, everybody. And I'll be hanging out, you know, in Slack for a while after this too, if we want to close down the Zoom. If anybody else, if there aren't any more questions, we can probably close down the Zoom in 2 minutes, and then I'll be hanging out in Esteemed Slack as usual, and I can talk to some people there. Maybe in the I'm not sure what's the right room for this. Maybe the Drupal channel. Although, you know, I mean, this primarily deals with Drupal behaviors, but the legal code also affects WordPress sites, or if you're doing whatever, Magento or whatever, you have to consider these things no matter what type of app you're building. By jQuery. I know it is a little sad. For those of us, the old timers, remember jQuery being a lot of fun and making things really easy. I remember certainly, fondly remember around circa whatever 2004 or something, doing my first accordion and thinking that it was just the coolest thing. Yeah, I'm calling myself old. I'm dating myself. I don't know about you guys, but jQuery is getting old. That's the truth. jQuery is getting old, and there are problems with jQuery. People are moving away from it. It's a big trend. It's not just me saying so. I'm just the messenger. You can still do a lot of good stuff with jQuery though. You'll still find it in the wild on lots and lots of sites for sure. And in fact, I haven't personally worked on a Drupal site for a client that probably didn't have some jQuery somewhere. I don't think that's happened yet. I do know that they're moving out of Drupal core, and there's a concerted effort to get it out of Drupal core to remove that dependency from Drupal core. I don't know whether that's completely removed in Drupal 9 or if that's just a goal that they're still working on. But I do know that things are moving in that direction. All right. So it's been an hour since we started. I can hang out maybe till 4:05 if anybody's got a question. But other than that, I think we've shut this thing down, and I will see you in Esteemed chat on the Slack. Anybody have closing words?
No, thanks. Always a great presentation. And thanks to everybody who came today. We appreciate having you here.
Absolutely. I appreciate everybody for coming and visiting, and appreciate the opportunity. And this one, maybe we'll put it up on YouTube because I feel like
we'll have it up.
Did too bad of a job.
Yeah.
All right. See you later, guys.
Cool. Thanks, everybody.
I'm gonna hang out until everybody signs out, just in case somebody has a question that they wanted to ask. More one-on-one or something. I don't know if that really is going to happen.
Yeah, you never know.
Certainly, if it's going to go on YouTube, it's not going to be private.
No, I can edit the end.
Cut the end off.
Yeah, I usually cut it at where it makes sense.
That's cool.
Yeah.
All right. How many attendees do we have now? We're down to 5.
Yes.
Well, thanks for coming, everybody. Thanks once again. This has been an Esteemed Lunch and Learn.
Yeah, I'm excited to see how gather.town works at Drupal Camp Florida. I was in it for a little bit the other day, just messing around. It could be a fun thing for us to bring into the Lunch and Learn environment as sort of like a virtual, Sims type of existence. I don't know if
it's like a Second Life type of
thing.
thing.
Yeah, exactly. That's funny, Second Life. I haven't thought about that in a while either. But yeah. It's kind of like that. It's funny, but it'll be interesting. Like, I guess you can walk up to people and it'll cue, a chat if you press, what is it, X or whatever the action button is, and then you can just start talking with people there. Kind of cool.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
I'll be there anyway. I got the ticket, so I'll be.
Yeah. It'll be fun.
I'm not going to leave a session. I have some more ideas for some other sessions, though. I might be able to work on that once I wrap up this client work right now.
Yeah, that's cool. What were you thinking?
I'm not going to get into it. All right. Well, thanks everybody for attending. We got 2 more minutes to make it an hour since I started talking. And if anybody has a last-minute question, still get it in under the wire. I think that's it.
I know. Sorry about the phone call, you guys. I got missed half of the thing, but I really enjoyed the first part of it because I got a lot of just little tidbits of information. I mean, I use a lot of that stuff already anyway, but it was kind of nice to get a little refresher on some of it. So
that's very cool. That's very cool. Yeah, we're going to upload the video if you want to catch the second half of it.
Okay.
Of course, you got to answer the phone if it's for a client or something. Absolutely.
Yeah.
That comes first.
Yeah, I was sort of a thing. I probably should have but I mean, you never know.
Yeah.
Cool.
All right, guys, we got 1 more minute and then I'm going to sign off.